Howdy everyone, and I've just completed testing out a lens that's excited me more than any other I've looked at this entire year. The Venus Optics Laowa 10 to 18mm f4.5 to 5.6 FE. Now 10 to 18mm is a typical zoom range for an ultra-wide angle lens for crop sensor cameras, but this lens is designed for full frame cameras. Thus, it is the widest angle rectilinear or non-fisheye lens that I have ever tested, and the widest angle rectilinear zoom lens on the market today. Its field of view on a full frame camera can be as wide as an amazing 130 degrees. It's designed for Sony's E-mount mirrorless cameras only, although I suspect that Venus Optics are probably working on designing versions for Canon and Nikon's new full-frame mirrorless cameras too. It will not work on a digital SLR camera at all. It's a fully manual lens, manual focus and manual aperture control, and when it's on general sale, it will cost $849 US. I love my Sony a7R II camera, and I love small-sized wide-angle lenses, so as soon as this one was announced, I got a bit excited and contacted Venus Optics to immediately request a sample for testing. They have kindly let me borrow an early production copy for a few weeks, just in time for me to take it on a trip to the island of Crete, so these sample pictures will have a Greek flavour to them. I'd like to thank Venus Optics for letting me test it out, but as usual, this is a totally independent review. I'll be looking at both its strengths and weaknesses. Okay, let's get a sense of how wide angle this optic really is. Here's some video footage taken with a normal zoom lens at 105mm on a full frame camera, and now zooming out to 24mm, already a wide angle in itself. Well, this Laowa lens starts at 18mm, already an ultra-wide angle, and zooms out from there to a cavernous 10mm. Just amazing. 10mm obviously gives an extremely dramatic perspective. Your images become all background, as all but the closest of subjects are pushed far away into the distance. It's pretty tricky to shoot at 10mm actually, as you have to angle and compose your shots so carefully. There's just so much being captured and involved that it's hard to control it all. But if you've got a nice image lined up, then there's nothing like it, and an angle of view that wide can be genuinely helpful when you simply cannot take another step backwards, as was the case in many of these pictures you see. A lens like this could be useful for capturing indoor areas like large banquet rooms, ancient Minoan palaces, or even just real estate photography. It'll also be extremely useful for architecture shots and landscape photography. It's worth bearing in mind that this lens only has a narrow maximum aperture of only f4.5 to 5.6 as you zoom in, but most landscape photographers won't really care about that, as they normally stop down to at least f8 or f11 for extra depth of field. And it's in landscape photography that I found myself enjoying this lens so much. It's small and fairly light, weighing under half a kilogram, about 1 pound, so I could take it anywhere with me. The zoom range meant that I had flexibility, and I wasn't just stuck at that crazy 10mm wide angle, which you would be if you bought the other 10mm rectilinear full frame lens on the market, the little Voigtlander 10mm f5.6. And the rear filter holder of the Laowa lens meant that I could easily use filters. That's right, this unbelievably wide angle lens accepts 37mm diameter filters in the rear. There's a multi-coated UV filter pre-installed, which you should keep in place if you're not using any other filter, but you can replace it with just about anything, so long as the filter in question has a thin profile. I got excellent results with this cheap pig iron 10-stop ND filter, allowing me to easily achieve long exposures. A fantastic idea. I did try to use a polarizing filter in there, a Hoya Slim one. However, I gave up in my efforts. Trying to turn it to the correct degree was complete trial and error. It didn't seem to give good results no matter how much I tweaked it, and even this thinner polarizing filter was too tight a squeeze, getting the lens onto the camera. I could fit it on, but it seemed to mess up the lens's minimum focus distance. That rear filter slot really is just for thin profile filters. Still, great feature. And for those who really like their big filters, Venus Optics have developed a magnetized 100mm filter holder for the front of this lens, able to hold 2 filters without vignetting, which will be available separately. I didn't get to try it out. And the lens has some other neat features. The aperture ring can work smoothly or with clicks, adjustable by this little switch, handy for video makers and still photographers alike. And the aperture mechanism has 5 straight cut blades, so if you stop down the aperture you can easily get some impressive 10-point sun stars. And everything else about the lens build quality is basically spot on. The focus and zoom rings turn smoothly with just the right amount of heaviness, and the lens's whole construction is tight, solid and metallic. Manually focusing is not really an issue, just set it to about 1 meter and almost everything will be in focus past that point at 10mm. It's easy to manually focus such a wide angle optic. Alright, enough about the build quality, now onto optics. We'll start by testing it on a demanding 42 megapixel sensor of my full frame Sony A7R II camera. At 10mm and straight from f4.5, we see plenty of resolution and contrast in the middle of the image. The image corners drag their heels, looking softer with some chromatic aberration and darkness from vignetting. Stop down to f5.6 for no particular improvement, but at f8 the corners are decently sharp. f11 is about the same. Let's zoom in a bit to 14mm. At f5 in the middle of the image, again we see good resolution and contrast, although not quite as sharp as at 10mm. The corners are pretty soft. f8 is a bit better, and f11 is averagely sharp. Let's zoom in all the way to 18mm. At f5.6, the image quality is slightly soft in the middle, with slightly low contrast. The corners again are quite soft. f8 is sharper in the corners and in the middle. f11 though is fantastically sharp in the middle and quite good in the corners, although the chromatic aberration is back again, and f16 is about the same. So, on a demanding 42 megapixel full frame sensor, the lens is struggling a bit, most of all in the image corners. However, stop down to about f11, it yields pretty good resolution, so landscape photographers will be quite satisfied I think. I believe there could be some field curvature going on there as well. Okay, let's fit the lens onto a 24 megapixel APS-C camera, where the 10 to 18mm focal length still projects an ultra-wide angle zoom range. At 10mm and f4.5, the lens is still fantastically sharp in the middle of the image. The corners are soft. They're sharper at f5.6 and good at f8, although chromatic aberration is visible. Zoom in to 14mm and at f5, the lens is fairly sharp in the middle of the image, but the corners are rather soft. At f8, there's a small improvement in the corners, although chromatic aberration is visible and image quality is extremely sharp in the middle. Zoom in all the way to 18mm and the image is a little soft in the middle from f5.6. The corners are very soft. They're about the same at f8, but there's an improvement at f11, as you would expect from seeing the full frame results, and the middle of the image is fairly sharp now too. So the lens is usable on an APS-C camera, just about, but it's clearly much more at home on full frame. Let's look at distortion and vignetting on a full frame camera. You'll see in this shot that my chart is a little out of focus. I focused the lens beyond the chart in case distortion is emphasized at shorter focal distances. At 10mm, we see a moustache pattern of barrel distortion, and there's quite some vignetting in the corners. That vignetting is somewhat reduced at f5.6 and again at f8, although it never really goes away, and you'll want to correct that vignetting in editing if you can. It's almost certainly quote-unquote natural vignetting, caused by the cosine fourth law of light fall-off in extremely wide-angle lenses, so it's completely what you would expect to see in a lens of this extreme nature. At 14mm, barrel distortion is greatly reduced, but there's still some gentle vignetting throughout the aperture range. Zoom in all the way to 18mm and the projected distortion has largely leveled out. Vignetting is visible, but gentle at f5.6 and is slightly reduced if you stop down to f8 or f11. Let's see how the lens works against bright light. At 10mm, odd specks of flaring pop up at particular angles, but generally, contrast holds up really well. Zoom into 18mm and bright lights cause a bit of glaring when they're in the picture. Finally, bokeh. This is a lens that is 100% not intended for getting out of focus backgrounds. If you do open up that aperture though and get close enough, then the little background separation you can get looks relatively smooth. So overall, the Laowa 10 to 18mm is an extreme device, but on my travels I definitely found it to be a really fun and useful one. It's not the sharpest tool in the box in terms of image quality, but to me that's understandable simply considering its incredible zoom range. You can forgive a lot a trailblazer, and it's decently sharp when the aperture is topped down enough, and users of 24 megapixel full frame cameras will probably be even more satisfied. Not everyone will be able to overlook its optical issues, and that's fair enough, and shooting at 10mm is tricky, but for me personally, this lens's small size, flexible zoom range, and ability to use small filters, and extreme nature are exactly the kind of thing I want and love. Its dramatic, gapingly wide images can be really astonishing, and so it comes recommended.